Welcome all on this very warm and balmy Monday evening. It's like the Scirocco from Sicily and from Northern Africa's arrived. I'm Nina Hall, for those who don't know me, Assistant Professor in International Relations. I'm hosting the event in lieu of Michael Lee, who would be here in person and will likely be here online, but is unable to be in Bologna today. He's in Brussels, where our guest comes from. I'm going to start off by introducing Heather. And she's going to talk to us about from European Green Deal to global Green Deal, how the climate transition will shape the EU's external action and Europe's role in the world. So for all of those here today interested in green and climate politics, I think this talk will be of real interest. And for those of you interested in the role of the EU internationally, I think this talk will be of real interest. And I can't think of a better person. We have Heather GRABBE to talk to us today about this issue. And she has a long-running set of experiences, both working inside the Commission as a former colleague, actually, of Michael Lee, she was just recounting, but also in her role now as senior advisor to the Open Society Foundations. She's a political scientist and an advocate for democratic pluralism and open societies. She was ranked highly among the women who shaped Brussels by Politico, and she gave a TED talk on the importance of critical thinking and mindful engagement with post-truth politics. She's written on climate change and technology and how they're affecting the quality of democracy and economic and social justice. And from 2004 to 2009, she was senior advisor to the European Commission for Enlargement, Olli Rehn, responsible for EU policy on the Balkans and Turkey. Previously, she was deputy director of the Centre for European Reform, where she wrote extensively on EU external policies and enlargement. She also conducted academic research at the European University Institute and in Florence, Chatham House, London, and Oxford and Birmingham universities, and taught at the LSE. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you here today. I think what we will do is we want to make this quite an engaging format. So Heather is going to speak to us first for about 10 to 15 minutes about the role of the EU in the global green transition. Then I have a series of questions and we'll have a conversation around that topic, and then I'll open the floor. So there'll be a good 40 minutes at least for all of you, both here in person and those of you online, to engage in this conversation. Welcome, Michael. Great to see you too. And so without further ado, I'll pass over to you. Thanks, Heather.
Well, thank you very much, Nina, for the introduction, to Michael and colleagues for the invitation. Great to see you joining us from Brussels. And thanks all of you for turning out on this beautiful evening when you could have been out in the piazza and having a beer instead. So I hope I'll give you a few provocative thoughts about the big emerging trends that we can see at EU level and how that is going to change things, both in terms of climate transition and also in terms of Europe's role in the world. So I'm very happy. I'm going to go quite big picture and sketch out some big emerging trends, and then very happy to go into more depth on any of them that interest you. So really, first of all, I just wanted to talk about what is the EU's role in the global climate transition. The EU has had environmental policies for a really long time, actually for decades. And if you look at the academic literature on EU environmental policies, most of them conclude that it's a bit underwhelming, that often there have been very lofty ideals and attempts at big agendas, which then failed because of various entrenched interests in the member states and from existing industries and so on. So although the EU did in fact do all kinds of interesting things like the REACH chemicals directive and also measures on biodiversity protection, these were not very impactful in terms of what we now recognize as really serious environmental degradation in Europe, and of course in the rest of the world, in supplying Europe with all of the goods that we like to buy from elsewhere. But this has really changed. in 2019, the European Parliament elections saw a green wave, not only of support to green parties, but also a greening of other parties, where the mainstream Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and others started to become more green because they could feel changes in society and changes among voters, particularly younger voters. There's a very important cohort effect here. And in particular, Ursula von der Leyen, in becoming Commission President through a highly unorthodox and unexpected procedure, had to make all kinds of promises to the groups in the European Parliament, including the new Green and Greened groups. And she pushed the European Green Deal up the agenda quite massively, appointed Frans Timmermans, who had been, in fact, one of the leading candidates for her position, into that job. And so at EU level, the politics on climate and also on environmental policies changed quite fundamentally. And for that reason, we now have a policy framework that's emerged at EU level, the European Green Deal, which is, I think, really more ambitious than any advanced industrialized economy has ever tried to implement. It's not perfect. An awful lot of it still needs to be worked out in terms of implementation. A lot of it is still on paper and not yet on the ground. But there is no other country or region on the planet that has taken climate change and the need to avoid further biodiversity loss, further depletion of the environment, as well as emissions, carbon emissions, so seriously. So that makes it extremely interesting, both for those of us interested in international relations, political science, economics, and those of us who'd quite like to live on a habitable planet in future decades. You know, this is really high stakes stuff. There's a lot of stuff that EU does that could fail or succeed and become simply the substance of PhD theses for the future. But on this, it really matters. It really matters, because if the European Green Deal doesn't work, its failure will be taken as a reason for other regions and countries not to act. You imagine how President Biden's successors might use that as a useful reason why the US shouldn't bother to do anything. And its success could shape the policy frameworks, the technological solutions, the kinds of investments that other governments and other regions make all around the world. So the stakes are extremely high, much higher than they've been on other big projects that the EU has embarked on, like, intergovernmental conferences and treaty change. And whereas, this really matters. This really affects things. I would argue it's the biggest thing since the creation of the single European market. So there are three big dimensions of why the European Green Deal matters for the rest of the world, why it's important. One is the first mover shaping power that I just mentioned, the success or failure of the European Union. And it's not a binary, it's either going to be all success or all failure. Of course, it's going to be a very mixed picture, but where it succeeds, it will inspire positive changes elsewhere. And where it fails, it will discourage all kinds of things. So it matters a lot to see how the sectoral transitions work out, the different aspects of policy that change, be that energy or mobility, transport, or consumer goods and so on. It's the first major comprehensive policy framework. And significantly, unlike in the US and in other attempts, there are legal and financial commitments behind it. So the EU has got the first climate law, and that's then causing climate laws to pass in member states of the EU. And that creates new legal frameworks for climate action, which are extremely interesting. And if any of you are looking for a master's thesis subject, especially if you speak German, I would really recommend having a super good look at the German Constitutional Court ruling of last year, the Bundesverfassungsgericht, which basically established a new legal principle that Germany's climate law was inadequate because, number one, it did not ensure the freedoms of future Germans, because it restricted too little the freedoms of current Germans. That's kind of a provocative way of putting it, but it had an intergenerational justice component, which is super interesting. And it also had an extraterritorial justice component by saying that the German government should not just be thinking about the interests of Germans, but also of citizens affected by Germany's actions elsewhere in the world. So this extraterritorial and kind of extra-temporal dimension, super, super interesting. So if you want to go into the law or the politics side of it, that is a great case case study. But that has meant new legal principles are coming up because of the fact that you've got legally binding commitments at EU level, which then has provoked various member states to look into this issue too. And financial commitments. So far, frankly, this part has been weaker because the EU doesn't have a giant fiscal power. It's got a budget of less than 1% of GDP, a lot of which is hypothecated already to agricultural and regional policies. But nevertheless, the European Green Deal happened then just before COVID, which then brought these recovery and resilience funds at EU level, which are bigger than the EU budget, and which are supposed to be devoted, a fixed percentage of them is supposed to be devoted to climate and environment issues. Again, a lot of slippage. We see a lot of greenwashing. We see governments doing things that are not ideal. But still, as a principle, that there could be a green marking of particular fiscal capacity at EU level, that's very significant. That's a big change from what we've had in the past. So this kind of first mover shaping power in terms of example effect, success or failure, but also first mover shaping power in establishing legal principles and also devoting some fiscal capacity. These are all unprecedented moves, which cause other regions also to take note. Secondly, there's the EU's famous regulatory power. Now, some of you may have seen a very nice book by Anu Bradford called The Brussels Effect, which is all about how the EU creates the rules and sets the standards that then change other markets. The EU is also doing this on green matters, on climate and sustainability. And I'll come back to this question of norms and standards. But this is also, the EU is also seeking through its regulation to create lead markets, to force whole sectors to change their business models. So its regulatory power operates through many different things. It operates through legislation. It also operates through trade measures. So some of you may have heard of the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, super great dinner party conversation stopper. But CBAM is very important because CBAM will, it's due to come into force in 2026. That's the timetable. There are those who will argue, you'll find think tanks arguing CBAM will never come into effect because it's too difficult to implement. But certainly what it's driving is a new set of regulatory norms around counting carbon, right? Calculating the carbon footprint of goods and services, which is completely revolutionary. I mean, the most important thing about environmental policy and why climate change policies have failed for many decades is the fact that most governments and most trade bodies and so on have no way of calculating the environmental externalities of production. Okay, it just doesn't feature in most economic models, including regulatory models. So the EU is creating new regulatory models, and its regulatory power is, of course, much greater than its fiscal power. So Biden could introduce the Inflation Reduction Act because there is a fiscal capacity at federal level. The EU doesn't really have that, but Biden doesn't have the regulatory power at federal level that the EU has for its region. So that's where the regulatory power is really worth looking at. And this that changes sectors. It changes, for example, the growth of renewable sector. It changes, for example, steel and aluminium, where the creation of just the threat of CBAM starts to create incentives for the production of green steel, basically with much reduced energy usage. These are very, very hard to abate sectors, as they're called, ones that use huge amounts of energy. And then there's the normative power. So the Brussels effect, and then the way that the EU, as the first mover, is creating the global norms and standards and criteria that will influence others in the transition and determine what counts as green. At the moment, it's extremely easy to do greenwashing because there are no standard accounting procedures for not only carbon footprint, but also the impact of production on biodiversity. There's very little to look at how resource efficient a production process is. These things don't really exist yet. So product and process standards, which is something the EU has done a lot of work on through the single market program and so on, will now have this additional dimension of sustainability. Standards for the circular economy, actually creating a circular economy that will affect not only uptake of recycling and reuse, but also it will change the primary products. So, for example, you won't be able to produce sofas that have foam in them which can't be reused, that stays non-toxic so that it can be used for making toys later, for example. That changes industries. That changes what manufacturers can do, both in Europe, things that are manufactured in Europe, but also what can be imported into Europe. So that has a big impact on, say, you're a global foam manufacturer and you sell in many countries. The European market for foam is really big because people in Europe are quite wealthy and they buy a lot of sofas. They buy a lot of other stuff that has foam in it too, also in the car industry, for example. So it makes sense for you as a foam manufacturer to reach for the highest standard, to do a race to the top in terms of standards and meet the European criteria, because you'll be able to sell that everywhere. If you're producing bulk foam, you don't want to have to produce one foam for Europe and another foam for the US and another foam for Latin America. You want to produce foam for everybody. So the European standards can drive an uplift in standards for everyone. And that's where circular economy and sustainable products initiative at the EU level really matter. And we've seen the way that this has already influenced other regions through organic labeling. Anybody could call their product organic in the past. And then when the EU actually came up with a standard for what counts as organic agriculture, that starts to affect standards in other regions as well. And just a final thing to watch in terms of the normative power is, at the moment, there are many companies which are saying our activities are Paris compliant. That's a very easy thing to say because there is no standard, there's no measure of what is Paris compliant. Okay, so the Paris commitments, the commitments made at the COP in Paris, are all about nationally determined contributions by countries, not by individual businesses. So if you're, say, I'm going to get sued if I mention a particular French bank, but say you're a very famous French bank and you say, we are Paris compliant. Nobody's able to say whether your operations in Senegal are compliant with either France or Senegal's nationally determined contributions. So this whole thing about Paris compliance, which is becoming important to companies to show their customers, and increasingly will become important also in terms of legal requirements. There need to be new standards, new criteria on this. And the EU is able to develop those kinds of standards and criteria in a way that the US cannot, because it's so hard now to get them through Congress. And we can come on to the complications of the US diverging on certain things like what the SEC is bringing in and so on. But it means that Europe is de facto creating the standards for circularity and for sustainability. So this all sounds like it could be a fantastic fan speech for Frans Timmermans. I could be Frans Timmermans telling you all of this, how wonderful Europe is. We are so fantastic. We're setting the standards for the world. We're making sure every consumer in the world has better foam and has reliable organic agriculture. We're using our regulatory power and our norm shaping power and our first move power because we love the world and we're benefiting humanity. There's a really dark side to all of this as well. And the dark side of this is that Europe is a consumer of huge amounts of imports, which are produced with terrible environmental standards elsewhere in the world, and where we are basically offshoring dirty production. And so far, the Green Deal has not gone very far in remedying that. And that's because it's actually very complicated to do it. So just to give you a few ideas about how this works. So Europe at the moment produces about 8% of global emissions. And if the Fit for 55 package that the Commission has produced succeeds in reducing the EU's carbon emissions by 55% by 2030, that's the goal. And Frans Timmermans, if he were standing here instead of me, he'd be telling you we're now on track as Europe to reduce them by 57.5%. We're doing much better. It's all going to be great. By 2030, we might have got to 60% reduction. But 60% of 8% takes Europe to below 5% of global emissions. Really small. Therefore, we're totally green. It's fine. But it's not, because that's only production in Europe. So if you only buy European-made products and services and agriculture is a bit trickier actually, but if you buy only European products, you're not contributing that much to global emissions. It's all fine. But we don't. We import most of our stuff. And the embedded carbon, the embedded water, and the embedded environmental degradation and pollution in the products that we import from the rest of the world is huge. So Europe is not just responsible for this little 8% reducing to below 5% very soon. Europe is also responsible historically for a large proportion of the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere, and responsible ultimately as the consumer of all of these textiles that are polluting the rivers in Bangladesh, all of these minerals that are mined in DRC, not all of them, but a large proportion of them that are mined in DRC in terrible labor conditions and with huge amounts of environmental degradation. And lots of products made with fresh water, which is becoming increasingly great supply. So that's the dark side of the great green story for Europe in the world. And that is complicated because it's not possible for the EU at this point simply to say, okay, we're just going to put up a whole load of trade barriers, and anybody who can't comply with our beautiful trade standards, our beautiful green standards, just can't export to the EU. That's the idea with CBAM, at least to start on carbon. Because many parts of the world which are producing for EU markets really need help to make the transition and actually to progress along their own transition paths. And this is where EU external policies have got to catch up with the Green Deal. They've got to really focus on how to help these other regions to make their own transition, both for the good of the environment and ultimately for all of humanity, but also because otherwise it's going to be massive disruption, economic, trade, supply chain disruption in Europe and in those countries. So give you the example of Bangladesh, where I mentioned, Bangladesh's exports are 90% textiles, and half of their textile production is destined for Europe. Okay, so if we stop buying fast fashion, which we need to do because it's enormously environmentally damaging, cotton is a very, very toxic crop. The garment dyeing and production in Bangladesh has caused a lot of environmental degradation. And by the way, Bangladesh as a delta is massively affected by climate change. Already you see this in the Sundarbans and so on. So if we stop buying fast fashion overnight, that would be good for the planet. It would be good for the environment. It would be good for Bangladesh in terms of environmental destruction, biodiversity, and climate. But it would be very bad for 4.5 million Bangladeshis who work in the textile industry. So what can Europe do to help Bangladesh to move to make the transition as an economy in a country that is already very much affected by climate change? And where environmental disaster is a big reality at times. So, floods and so on. So development policies, EU trade and development policies need to take these effects of the Green Deal into account, not as we must stop this policy because it's causing bad things elsewhere in the world, but as we have to make this a global transition. It doesn't work if it's just a European transition. We have to find ways to smooth the transition paths of other countries and regions. And of course, we can't go back to the legacy of the past, which is the European colonizers coming and telling a country what to do. If we look at what's likely to happen in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27 over the next few weeks, other countries are going, European Green Deal, up yours. You've got to think about how the commitments to reducing carbon emissions fit with the rest of the economy, the global economy, including trade flows. And Europeans are not in a terribly good position to kind of take the moral high ground on here, not only because of our responsibility for how many greenhouse gases are already in the atmosphere, which will cause in the future natural disasters that we used to think of as being acts of God to be blamed on Europe and the US, because think about the floods in Pakistan at the moment that have displaced 33 million people. They've lost their homes and their livelihoods. A lot of that is because of climate change, a lot of the reason behind that. And people will start to blame the Europeans and the US. So there's a historical moral responsibility for taking faster action. But it's also, and that's why the debate about loss and damage is going to be huge at COP27. That's what much of the global South is already really want to talk about. It's a new reparations debate. So, and this could even get worse if there's a new era of extractivism initiated by the drive to decarbonize the European economy, because we're going to need raw materials from many other parts of the world in order to decarbonize. Basically we need lithium, we need cobalt and things which are much of the world supply is not found in Europe. So I've already given you 15 minutes. So I'm just going to finish by sketching out 3 aspects of big new trends that will affect the EU's role in the world, which we can go into any of them which are interest you. So the first one is beyond the European Green Deal, if you think about how economic policy is changing, for the past 30 years, we've had a very big focus on efficiency and growth as the main goals of economic systems and economic policy. But now with the war and energy prices going up, energy becoming much scarcer and so on, we're starting to see resilience as a really important goal. So I think a very interesting question is, what will be the role of the state in the future as climate change makes all of our economic systems much less resilient, as supply chains that are very long are revealed to be rather fragile, and that makes the public nervous? Will that mean fewer trade deals? Will it mean much more government intervention in markets as well in order to shore up resilience? And secondly, this, of course, interacts with geopolitics, because resilience is about, I would argue, is about building a circular economy, making yourself less dependent on these long supply chains, but that changes your relationship with the countries on the other end of the supply chain. So I gave you the example of Bangladesh, but of course, another very big example is China. Does reducing dependency on China mean that Europe has to go into rivalry with China, as the US has done? Or does it mean having a very different way of engaging with China on climate, as well as on trade and so on? And then finally, another very big issue, the Cinderella of environmental policy, is resource use. We talk about climate and carbon emissions a great deal. We're starting to talk about biodiversity more, which is very important. In fact, the threats to human health and habitation from collapse of biodiversity could be even greater than climate change. But resource use is what drives a lot of the environmental degradation. And I gave you the example of fast fashion, and this need to address the embedded emissions, water use, pollution, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. It means we have to become a lot more efficient about using resources. At the moment, they're unpriced. We can just buy resources from wherever they're cheapest on the planet, because the environmental impact of that resource extraction is not factored into the price, because our economic models don't contain it. So how could a circular economy make a more resilient as well as a more green economy? And our shorter supply chains a very good way of ensuring both better environmental performance, but also more security for Europe. This is a very different set of ideas from the ones that have dominated the past 30 years, which have been about globalization and liberalization and freeing up markets. We're thinking about a much bigger picture of economic change, which has been driven by the war as well as by the European Green Deal. So I hope that gives you a few provocative ideas.
Thank you. Lots to dig into. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions, but as I'm speaking, for those of you who are joining online, please do get ready and write your questions. And for those of you in person, please also think about some questions. I want to elaborate a little bit more on the geopolitics of all this, because obviously this weekend we had Xi Jinping being pronounced as the continual leader for at least another 5 years, if not for more. And it seems to me that what you paint both here and in other things you've written, that the EU's in quite a problematic position, because it is relying so much, if I understand correctly, on Chinese raw materials. And both for, solar panel, the Chinese have a massive solar panel industry. So if the EU really does want to go green, and it is in a state right now of being so reliant on China, yet China has very problematic authoritarian policies and increased repression, which the EU's also suggested it doesn't want to support. What does the EU do? And what should it do?
It's a really difficult conundrum, and different politicians are taking very different stances in Europe already. Because basically, to sum it up, what Vladimir Putin has done this year is to turbocharge the energy transition. Now, that's meant some steps backwards into more fossil fuels and in building even more fossil fuel infrastructure like LNG and so on. But it's also meant turbocharging the forward move into renewables, which is ultimately the way of decarbonizing energy usage and hence decarbonizing European industry. But the tricky thing is that Europe used to have a solar panel industry. We used to have the renewables manufacturing in Europe until about 12 years ago, when it more or less all moved to China, because Chinese manufacturing is so much cheaper because wages are so much lower. And in fact, most of the Chinese solar panels are made in Xinjiang by forced labor. Okay, so they're super cheap. There's no way German wage bargained collective action unions could compete with that. But it's a problem because not only if you wanted to start up a new manufacturing capacity in Europe and declare it a strategic sector, which some people would like to do, you need to have the raw materials to make the solar panels. Also, by the way, batteries, which are obviously another key part of the decarbonized economy. And China controls about 90% of the raw materials. So that means it's not possible. I mean, it's not possible in economic terms simply to decouple from China in the way that Europe has, with amazing speed, actually decoupled from Russia. It's a completely different story. But the geopolitics are also complicated. So to come to your question, in the US, you see this a huge amount of talk about new Cold War and US-China. It's no longer a G2 world, it's a G2 contest. And most European political leaders have been, until now, quite reluctant to join in that kind of talk. Instead, what you've had much more often from European political leaders and trade negotiators and so on is, well, actually, it's really important to continue commerce with China. China buys also a lot of European technology and other exports. And also, we're Europeans. We don't want rivalry with others. You know, we learned that lesson in World War II. The whole reason for setting up the European Union was that if you trade with other people, you know, Wandel durch Handel, that if you trade with other people, then their country becomes more dependent on you and you on them. And this interdependence means you don't go to war and you can have peace and you can basically move, as Churchill put it, from war to jaw. And this is all better. So, you know, it's in our DNA. It's not just a kind of posture or a decision about trade policy. It's in our DNA that we want to cooperate and we don't want to create rivals and we don't want to create enemies. And so that's why a lot of European political leaders and negotiators were very reluctant to go with this US thing. And now that it's bipartisan in the US, you know, initially it was, oh, well, it's Trump and he's a bit crazy. What can you do? And now, no, the Democrats are also pretty hot on this. What do we do? What do we do? And there's still not an answer. And you find very different answers now. So there are some who work on trade policy who say, well, we do need to decouple actually from China and start more manufacturing here in Europe. The French, of course, have always been more keen on industrial policy and declaring strategic sectors. Germany used to be the main site of the solar panel industry in Europe and wouldn't mind getting it back. But this just doesn't fit with the economic orthodoxy to do this. So it's a real conundrum, and a very fierce debate is going on now. And the debate is about several different issues. Okay, so part of the debate is about the very practical issue of how do we get the solar panels? How do we get the wind turbines? Wind turbines are still largely produced in Europe, but some of the wind turbine production is now moving to the US because of the Inflation Reduction Act, basically bringing in bigger subsidies in the US. But there's real fear about that. And solar panels are becoming very scarce in Europe. It's actually quite hard to find them. There are not enough of them for all the people who would now like to decarbonize because their gas bills have gone up so much. So this is a very practical problem, that if we're going to do this decarbonization, we need the solar panels. Where the hell do we get them from? Then you've got a second, and you know, it doesn't really matter what price we can pay, because the other thing is China is serious about climate policy and is seeking to decarbonize its own industry. So in fact, China's own domestic demand for solar panels is going up hugely. So in fact, China needs that production for domestic use, and therefore there's going to be less available for export. So these are quite practical things which are not necessarily in the, you know, just, it's not just a decision that gets made in Beijing. It's a more complicated thing than that. Then the second set of issues is around what are the standards for making these things? Now, the EU has just brought in some new provisions about not buying from sources, buying production made with forced labor. And there's also mandatory due diligence for companies to look at their supply chains and see whether there are human rights abuses at some point in the supply chain or indeed environmental destruction. And this mandatory due diligence starts getting factored into their credit ratings, for example. It starts to get factored into what kind of collateral they can put up to banks and banks can put up to central banks. So it's there in the system. And again, all very necessary because we just haven't, these factors have been treated as externalities in the past, but makes the relationship with China even more fraught, even more difficult to deal with. Then you've got the whole transatlantic agenda, where many Europeans are, perfectly happy to do business with Biden and to talk to Biden, but real fear about what happens in 2024. That already the Buy American provisions have kept in the IRA have kept Europeans out of parts of the renewables market in the United States, which actually paradoxically makes the US more dependent on China. But it also complicates things because basically you can't rely on a transatlantic alliance anymore because you don't know what's going to happen in the White House come 2024. And then there's this question of the DNA and the geopolitics, and I'll be interested to know what Michael thinks about this, having worked at EU level for many decades. But this reluctance to go into rivalry, it's something that France is more comfortable with. It's something that Germany is not at all comfortable with. And so it's hard to get a European position on it as well. And plus different EU member states have different kinds of trade structures with China. Germany sells a huge number of cars into China. So the last thing they want to do is to have a trade war with China. France sells less into China. And so there's less of an incentive. And so member states have different kinds of relationships, but also different kinds of incentives to continue with this. So it's a conundrum and there is no end in sight.
I want to ask one more question because I am aware of time and I want to also hand over to the audience. And that's more of a specific one about trade policy, because what struck me in your talk is that when we're talking about climate policy, we're not just talking about what comes out of DG Klima. We're not just talking about what's happening in the environment or the climate space, but the intersection with other economic and international and trade policies that the EU is making. And in my other nerdy hat, I like following New Zealand foreign policy. And as we were talking about over lunch, New Zealand and the EU recently signed a trade agreement, which claims to be a new generation trade agreement and the first to include sanctions if either party to the agreement doesn't hold up to the Paris Accord. So the idea here is that both New Zealand and the EU have to be good climate actors. Maybe that all works, but what does that actually mean? Can trade agreements work for the climate in that way? Do you have any faith that if that was to become a new norm, that all trade agreements had some kind of sanction enforcement that would actually improve the situation? I'm curious to hear your opinions on how trade policy can be used to address climate change.
Yeah, well, the EU has sought to have human rights clauses and environmental clauses in its trade agreements for a very, very long time. In fact, since the 1990s, I don't remember what was the first one, but I think it's since the 1990s. And I believe that to date, none of those human rights clauses has ever actually been triggered. So even though the EU has trade deals with some extremely non-human rights respecting regimes, it's been reluctant to disrupt the trade relationship. And it's also very difficult to enforce them because it's one of these negative things where what do? You stop trading with that country. But then what if European industry wants to keep trading with that? What if European consumers wish to have that country's products? What do? So although trade deals have been seen as a kind of incentive to try to get countries to improve their human rights and environmental records, as I understand it from those who've looked at this a lot, and Karen Smith, for example, LSE has looked at this in some detail, they've not been enormously effective. These kinds of provisions, but they have been important because in the European Union, trade deals have become increasingly controversial. Now, you may recall that there was this thing called TTIP around some time ago, which was an attempt at a transatlantic trade and investment partnership that never came about. It died a death. It died a death both because of different interests in the US and in the EU around chlorinated chicken, you probably heard about, and beef hormones and other stuff that European consumers didn't like. But it also died a death because the idea of trade deals is not very popular among some parts of Congress. Because there was a sense that the US economy had something to lose. That was more on the left. That was actually more from the Democrats and the Republicans, but it died. But it also died because of a social movement. There was real objections, and it died because trade deals have to be ratified by every EU parliament, and that includes the Walloon Parliament, which is the French-speaking regional parliament in the EU, who unexpectedly held up CETA, which was the Canada-EU trade agreement that did eventually get through. And the idea of going through all of that again with TTIP was just too much. And I think that at the time, it was a big shock for trade policy. It was like, wow, if we can't get a trade deal with the US, where are we going to go? But I think it was actually the beginning of the end of, or it was really the end of the era for those kinds of big trade deals. And it's very hard to get trade deals now. So the EU-New Zealand one, the very fact that there's some controversy about it, in the past, it would have been seen as the ultimate friendshoring. You know about friendshoring, the idea that instead of offshoring production, you only accept production from a country that's quite like-minded. So on the whole, Europeans, if you think about Asia Pacific, New Zealand is possibly the most like-minded country, at least under this government. And so New Zealand's perfect for friendshoring. And yet it's still controversial because people are nervous about globalization. People are nervous about trade not delivering what it promised. And that makes then bringing conditionality into those trade agreements even more complicated. And finally, one of the things that people really hated about CETA and about TTIP was the idea of something called investor state dispute resolution. And dispute settlement, ISDS. And these were provisions that used to be in trade agreements all over the place that basically allowed companies to take governments to court for not respecting the provisions in the trade agreement. And then the social movement, which was against trade deals, started going, hang on a sec, why is it that companies have more rights than consumers and even than governments? Why is that possible? And we now see this with the dispute, with the big controversy there is about the Energy Charter Treaty, which is something similar, again, where companies can take governments to court if they don't deliver on commercial deals. But the problem is that with the Energy Charter Treaty, those are commercial deals that are quite climate damaging. So this whole there's a real zeitgeist, a Zeitenwende, as the Germans say, a change in people's thinking, a change in the times, in thinking about trade deals, in thinking about what's good for the public interest as well as what's good for the climate. And I think that's the reason why these policy intersections are getting so much more complicated.
Thanks for that. And also for the mention of social movements. My recent book that just came out explores exactly that trade politicization that happened in the EU. So I think there's lots more to unpack about what gets politicized and for what reason. But I'll stop my questions, although I have a whole long list more, and I'll hand over, Michael, I can see you have a hand up. So I'll hand over to you first, and then we'll go to some of the students in the room.
Well, thanks very much, Nina. Thanks for being with us this evening. Heather, lovely to see you. So sorry I can't be there in person. We've swapped cities for the evening, but we'll get together sometime soon. Just to tell people, we were colleagues way back when Heather was the senior advisor to the commissioner at the time, Olli Rehn, now head of the central bank in Finland. Heather, I was tremendously interested in your presentation. I took lots of notes. Each note, I think, could be the subject of a debate or a session. But I'd like to ask you about something that you only mentioned very much in passing, in referring briefly to the war in Ukraine. And that is, what is the relationship between this whole agenda that you've been discussing and energy security? I mean, when I look back over the last decade or so, what I see in the EU was, first of all, an effort to build up an energy policy with Juncker's calls for energy union and all the rest of it. the energy agenda then got rather submerged in a climate agenda and was almost lost sight of, in fact. And some people felt that energy policy had actually become climate policy. But now with the war, finally, energy security is not only back on the agenda, but is at the top of the agenda. And what energy security seems to mean for most political leaders is making sure that there are sufficient supplies of electricity, of gas, of petrol and diesel for cars. With Germany phasing out nuclear, it means much greater use of coal in Germany and elsewhere. The German economic model, which is still based on manufacturing, and as we know, export to China and elsewhere, very heavily dependent on fossil fuels. Italy negotiating new fossil fuel deals with Algeria, with Libya, congratulating itself on getting new supplies of gas and all of that. Now, you quoted Timmermans as saying that the target for 2030 is going to be over-fulfilled, so to speak. But what do you think about that? Do you think it will? It's 8 years away. And do you think that this green agenda will stand up to the new priority being given to energy security?
Okay, lots of really interesting stuff there. I will dive in, and I know from a chat I had with some of the students before the before this part of the evening that there's a big interest in energy and energy politics and so on. So thank you, Michael, also for kind of sketching out kind of how things have evolved, because you're right. I mean, energy has always been a really key part of the single market. It's a strategic sector for every economy because it so much drives everything else. You literally can't. You can't have all the other activities without it. So I want to just think about three different aspects of this, just to kind of try and get our heads around what's going on now. So one aspect is the short-term drive for just new supplies, as you were just saying, the kind of desperate drive, in fact, by countries like Italy to just secure any supply of energy, no matter how dirty. The Germans burning a lot more coal, which will make it much harder for them to reach their targets for emissions reductions. Deals with new autocrats. I mean, it's horrendous how many autocrats have been bolstered by the war that Russia, Putin has helped Maduro in Venezuela, Bouteflika in Algeria, the regime in Qatar, because suddenly these autocrats who control fossil fuels have new sources of revenue, the prices are much higher, and everybody's desperate to do deals with them. Saudi Arabia. So the kind of moral high ground has been completely taken away as European governments are not only doing deals, they're competing with each other to do deals. Who can get to Saudi Arabia fastest and get a guarantee of long-term supply? It's horrible to watch. That's the short term. And so the short term is bad. The short term also means building of new fossil fuel infrastructure. Think about just this week, the construction of a new gas pipeline between Barcelona and Marseille, which was a deal between the French and Spanish governments. Think about the new LNG terminals that lots of countries are trying to construct. Now, some of them are they're floating terminals, they're kind of more temporary, but it's a lot of public money, taxpayers' money, which is being spent on more fossil fuel infrastructure rather than making the transition happen. So there's a big opportunity cost here. And not only that, it creates lock-ins to fossil fuels in the future, because once you've built some of these big infrastructure projects with public money, you need to keep running them for several decades in order to get a return on the investment. So even in terms of public accounts and so on, it locks governments into fossil fuel infrastructure as well as companies. This is really bad news. When we've only got, according to the UN climate experts, 8 years to make this transition to reach peak emissions and then bring them down. And when we've now got rising interest rates, and therefore public money is much less available. So it's really painful to see this money being spent on more fossil fuels. Okay, so that's the very bad news in the short term. And that short term could go on for another couple of years, because it's not just this winter we need to get through, but it's also the next winters. And this winter, we've got gas storage at capacity already. Next winter, we will not, because Putin has kind of removed the moral dilemma about whether to buy Russian gas by cutting off the supply himself and then sabotaging pipelines and so on. Okay, so short term is not so short term, could be here with us for at least another 2-3 years. And we need to see how cold the winter is. It's balmy here right now. There are predictions that there will be a massive cold spell because of the disruption of Arctic weather patterns because of climate change that could bring very cold spell later this winter, which will then deplete the reserves. So short term is looking pretty bad, actually. Then you've got the kind of medium term and really thinking about the energy transition, because as I mentioned earlier, the drive for renewables has, of course, also been driven up because of prices. Okay, so the fact that we're buying, there is a pretty outrageous thing going on. We are, as of in September this year, we were paying as much revenue to Russia for Russian hydrocarbons as this time last year, as September 2021, but only getting a quarter of the amount in return because prices are so high. So, but those price signals also have a different effect, which is they cause everybody to start thinking about saving energy, turning down the thermostat, thinking about German industry has done an amazing thing of reducing energy usage by gas consumption by 20% this year so far, that's just between March and October. And the European economy as a whole is using 15% less energy. That's remarkable. That shows how many inefficiencies there were in the system while energy was cheap. So there's been a big pulling back, and that's good to know. And I think that energy saving has gone from being a kind of slightly yes, and I should also eat more fruit and vegetables, and yes, I should also get more exercise kind of thing, to being like, actually, I really need to do this. And not only for businesses, but also for households, because we just can't afford to pay these gas and electricity bills. And so it's the price signal is actually having an effect. So energy saving becomes more important. People start really to insulate their homes. And in fact, the big problem now is shortage of labor. In fact, we don't have enough skilled labor to do all of the retrofitting of insulation. So the kind of medium term energy saving and switch to renewables with existing capacity has been given a big boost, and there are now renovation premiums in many countries. So that's good. That's some good news that people are starting to save energy, and they're starting to get really serious about insulation and things like that we should have done long ago. Really basic stuff we should have done a long time ago. Then you've got the long term. Okay, so long term where we need to be is basically 100% renewables. And there's plenty of technology available to do this. There's solar PV, there's wind turbines, there's tidal power, there's onshore and offshore wind, there's hydro, which many parts of Europe are already using. There's lots of possibilities there. And a move to 100% renewable power is perfectly feasible. In theoretical terms for Europe. It's perfectly feasible. Already Germany, on a sunny, windy day, Germany has been for 10 years self-sufficient in renewables only for 10 years. The problem is it's not always a sunny and windy day. And so you get these Dunkelflaute, as they call them in Germany, where when they need the base load. So there are technical, complex things to do with energy systems where you need to continue having some kind of mix for a long time, where when renewables, when you don't have enough sun or enough wind, you need to have some way of actually making sure that the power is continuous. Now, there's several ways of doing this. The current one is to have a mix of different energy sources. So when it's not sunny in France, you just rely on the nuclear baseload, which brings its own problems. When it's not windy in Germany, you rely on French electricity produced by nuclear. Oops. But what you really need is a different way of thinking about it. One is to have an integrated grid, so that something France has blocked for decades, so that when it's cloudy in Germany, the Spanish sunshine can produce enough solar from Spain to supply electricity also in neighboring France, which can then send more non-nuclear electricity to Germany. Okay, but we don't have that grid. So Michael referred to the Juncker's Energy Union. A lot of that was about building the infrastructure to create a really integrated European energy system. We haven't even had reverse flow of gas for a long time. So finally, some investments are being made in the grid. And by the way, they also extend to countries outside the European Union. Amazing thing, an amazing technical feat that the Ukrainians and Moldovans did in March this year was to synchronize their electricity grids with the EU grid in incredibly difficult circumstances of war. And that's one of the only things that's kept the lights on as the Russians destroy energy infrastructure in those countries. So this, having a pan-European energy grid would actually be really beneficial. But you need to have it then based on renewables production in order to stop the carbon emissions. And that means you need quite massive investment in the renewables technology. So we have two problems with that. One is that the supply of the raw materials is not adequate, it's not sufficient, and it's also primarily controlled by China. And the second thing is that, and so then we come to the question of whether, is it possible to get a social license to do mining and processing of raw materials in Europe? Okay, now, I don't know how many of you have visited a lithium mine, probably not many, but it's not a pretty sight. It's really horrible in terms of disfiguring the landscape, but also the processing takes a huge amount of water and it's very polluting. That's why people in Serbia, where not very many really high quality jobs are available right now, turned down an investment by Rio Tinto in a lithium mine in Serbia. Imagine what the protests would be like in Spain. Spain has lithium, but are Spaniards willing? Are they going to give democratic consent to mine it? So the issue of raw materials is going to become a huge thing in European politics, because in the end, we've got to get to a renewables driven economy.
It's fascinating. I want to hand over to the students now, and we'll collect a batch of questions, 2 or 3, or even 4. Who wants to go first? You want at the back, right? Jonathan.
Well, first, thanks for coming to Bologna. It's been a really pleasure to hear you talk. Sorry. My question is around the transition in norms that you talked about, especially with the private sector. As part of my thesis research, I was able to get an interview with the president of the International Capital Markets Association. Thanks, Slice. And from his perspective, he was saying how a lot of corporates are really begging for something like the EU green bond standard to help them figure out exactly how to issue a green bond and not run into issues of being accused of greenwashing or have to spend lots of money hiring people in order to help them create that in-house. So was just wondering to hear your perspective on broader private sector norms of not only private sector being willing to go along with regulation, but actually asking for additional regulation.
Yeah. Wait 1 minute. I've got another question to add.
Okay.
I want to get a few questions in there because I also can see Verena Ringler, who's asked a question online, and her question is, she's a SICE class of 2002. She works at the Agora Europe in the European Green Deal. And she says she has 2 questions. One, how has the European Green Deal impacted the diplomatic profession already, especially the European External Service? And 2, it's a separate question on biodiversity. Verena says, if we look back in 1975, the Helsinki Accords were signed. They led to the one and only existing table of conversation between the Soviets and the US for many years. And one key space of action was the cultural change. So fast forward, do you see any chance for biodiversity to become the new culture? Can this seemingly overlooked element of the green transition agenda act as a unifier between countries who are currently, as you described, in rivalry relationships like the EU, Russia, China, and the US? So there's 3 questions, and we will go back for a second round of questions after that. So keep thinking.
Wow, really chunky questions. If I ruled the world, that would be a simple answer. No, there are no simple answers. So yeah, this issue about the private sector asking for norms is a really interesting and important one. It's okay. Just closing the door. Oh, thank you. Because, of course, it's really inefficient for companies to have lots of different standards out there. And I think that's one of the things that's caused a lot of alarm, where the EU and the US have been unable to agree on standards. It would be much easier for large companies, especially, to have the rule book really clearly laid out and to have transatlantic agreement on it, because it's so much cheaper to comply with just one set of rules rather than multiple sets of rules. Plus, there's a credibility problem for businesses. Progressive businesses trying to do the right thing by decarbonizing and reducing their overall environmental footprint, then find their investments go to waste when their rival can claim to be just as green as they are without actually having done the work. So there's a disincentive. In fact, it causes a disincentive to those who are really taking it seriously, which is a problem. And then you've got the problem of, as you were saying, even regulators having to create in-house standards, and it's very expensive and time-consuming to try to create technical standards. Often, so much better. I mean, I know the International Accounting Standards Body, for example, association, is trying to, how do you measure these things? How do you put them in the accounts? We're entering a new world where finally we're bringing the externalities of environment into our economic system, right? We should have done that 50 years ago. Okay, we're finally doing it now, but it's a messy and complicated business. It takes time, and having multiple standards makes it so much worse. So I think this thing of the private sector asking for standards is a very interesting one, and to study it in terms of doing a thesis on it, fantastic. And it's a little bit, so I did my PhD thesis on post-communist transition, and I did lots of interviews with policymakers and regulators and so on. And one of the points they made in the 1990s was, they said, we didn't bother to ask for lots of different technical standards and models, policy models. We just adopted the EU ones because we wanted to get in, but it also just stopped a lot of debate and wasted time and energy. Because even if we knew that EU competition policy, for example, or EU single market standards were not ideal for our economy, to search for alternatives would have been so time consuming and expensive, and also caused so much political controversy. It just wasn't worth doing. So this was already happening then. So you've got some nice historical precedents for it, but also it's where it's about to become, I think, a good deal worse, because there is now pushback, especially in the US, from political forces that do not want the climate transition to happen, and who are trying to sue companies for trying to comply with green standards. So then it's not only driven, the private sector then has these conflicting pressures on different sides. So I think that would be a super interesting thing to look at. Also, you can see how standards are very much politically influenced. So the EU created this green taxonomy of how green things are, and they included both nuclear and gas in it. Gas because the Germans wanted that, nuclear because this was before the war, and nuclear because the French wanted it. So political compromises, these aren't just technical standards, they're extremely politicized in some cases. But you also see regulators trying to find the right thing, which may have inadvertent effects. So another thing you could look at is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which in the US is introducing risk criteria that will affect the way that banks are able to operate. They've got to calculate environmental and climate risk they've got to declare, they've got to do disclosure of their climate risk in ways that forces them to count it. So again, they're like, okay, just tell us how to bloody well count it. Don't make us all do it differently and potentially fall foul of the regulators. European Central Bank wants collateral that banks put up in return for credit to be climate proofed. They want to know what the climate risk is. So again, how do you assess the climate risk? The insurance industry is desperate to find good methods of calculating climate risk. So this creation of a whole new set of standards and risk calculations, it's really complicated, it's really necessary, and it's causing a lot of chaos in the meantime. So I think a fantastic thing to do would be to do a study of, say, just one standards body, because that would be doable as a master's thesis, or one industry, and what kind of lobbying they do. What kind of lobbying do they do in Brussels, in DC, in member state capitals? Because it's happening live. So this is the perfect moment to do a case study and gather raw material, because then everybody will want to read your book chapter or your journal article. So I just suggest that as a positive way of thinking about the chaos that is going on standards. The second question, Verena's question about, and very nice to see your words on the screen, Verena, the impact on the diplomatic profession. So I don't know across the board, but I did have an opportunity to talk to the EU Diplomatic Corps a couple of weeks ago, because I did a panel with Frans Timmermans on the Green Deal in front of the EU Diplomatic Corps, who were gathered in Brussels for the first time since COVID. So you had all the EU ambassadors and special representatives and heads of various EU missions in the room. And you know what they wanted to know about? This just to give you a little kind of anecdotal snapshot of what they're concerned about. They wanted to know how much EU development policy is really going to change. So that was quite interesting to see how much the kind of international partnerships side is. They wanted to know about green hydrogen in a big way, especially those located in Africa, because that is a key part of the development agenda for countries like Namibia, for example. They really wanted to know about new economic opportunities for European markets, for the countries in which they're based, because a large part of their job is about fostering trade and investment relationships between the EU and the country in which they're working. So they're very much interested in new opportunities, particularly in countries that haven't really had which have, say, abundant natural resources like sunshine, but don't have an existing strong trade relationship with the EU. And they were also very interested in how on earth to explain the European Green Deal to partners elsewhere in the world who just see it as green colonization, who see it as another set of European protectionism wrapped in a beautiful green wrapper this time, who see CBAM, for example, as something that is just a big stick that the EU is going to come and whack them with, and who don't see how the EU is going to ease their transition at all. They just see it as a big new set of problems that the EU is causing. So that just gives you a flavor of the kinds of questions that they were asking about, which shows how much the European Green Deal needs to be explained to the rest of the world, not just in we Europeans are doing everybody a favor by reducing our emissions. It's to be explained with a much more sophisticated set of arguments. And finally, this question about biodiversity, I'm really glad you asked that, because the science on biodiversity is actually very, very scary. And that's why I mentioned this factor that in the end, for most of us and our children and grandchildren, loss of biodiversity could have a much bigger impact on our lives, disastrous impact on our lives, even than climate change. We can probably adapt to climate change much better. But just to give you a snapshot of where that is, okay, so we all know about COVID. COVID is just one of many diseases that are jumping the species barrier as human beings intrude further and further into parts of nature which didn't have human contact before. There's lots more. There's also things like the permafrost defrosting, what's in the tundra in northern, in Siberia, for example. There are lots of diseases there, which, anthrax is just one of the ones we know about. There are lots we don't know about, which will be released into the atmosphere and which humans will come into contact with. So COVID may be the first of a lot of different kinds of pandemics that we don't really know how to deal with. And pollinators. So 70% of the food we eat depends on little insects doing their job quietly, unnoticed, in fact, even kind of resented. So it's the bees and the hoverflies and all these little insects that do their job. They are being devastated by certain pesticides, by loss of habitat, by monocultures, by also diseases that can wipe out a whole bee colonies, commercial bee colonies, because you probably don't know a lot about this, but bees are actually shipped around in sacks from field to field. There's a whole bee pollination industry. And if all of those bees who are of a particular species get a disease at the same time, they all die. So the lack of diversity in the bee population because of commercial farming and commercial pollination is a huge problem. So those are just two snapshots of really bad stuff that can come and hit us. And where Verena is completely right, that there needs to be US, EU, Russian, Chinese cooperation, because we're all going to suffer if crops fail because of lack of pollinators, if zoonotic diseases hit us all. COVID was not a beautiful story of fantastic global solidarity and cooperation and vaccine justice. Not a great story. Could get worse if you have other diseases coming along. So the need for global governance and for countries to work together has never been greater at a moment when multilateral institutions are pretty weak and don't enjoy a lot of public support. So yeah, the next module is obviously global governance of climate risks, and how do we move into a very different way of thinking about them.
Thanks for that. We're just about coming up to time, but there is one online question. I just want to check, is there anyone in the audience here who wanted to ask a question? Yes, question at the back. Keep them short and sharp.
My first question is, I mentioned this historical to ease the transition for all these other countries that are suffering the offshoring and all the things like exported emissions, right? But this requires financing. And my question is, to what extent do you think the Green New Deal addresses that? And on a global level, what do you think would be an ideal way to conduct that as well, right? Like, how do we determine the criteria for a country to receive funding, and how, you know, we say that amount of GDP has to be dedicated to this? Like, how do we structure this, like financial support? And my second question is just on nuclear. Because I mean, I grew up in France, so 30% of our energy is from nuclear. And my question is, how much do you think it should, if it should at all, play a role in the
Great, thanks. And I'm going to add in the question from David Manna. Thanks for asking it, which builds sort of on the first question. And he asks, a lingering question from COP26 was how developed countries should provide funding to developing countries who are most affected by climate change and climate-driven disasters. So how does the European rush towards fossil fuels for energy security affect the prospect for developing and formalizing funding? And I guess a more specific version of that, as we talked about at lunch, is the loss and damage agenda, quite specifically. So if Pakistan has been affected by floods, they can claim loss and damage that Europe or someone in the global north should pay. So building on that first question, what are the prospects at this coming COP in a couple of weeks on loss and damage?
Sorry to disappoint you, but I think that the prospects are pretty dark, but there will be tons of material that you could gather to write a really interesting thesis on this subject. Okay, because this COP will be mostly about loss and damage. That's what the global South countries are coming with as their primary agenda. We saw it already at the UN conference in Bonn in June this year. It already started at COP in 26 in Glasgow last year. And it's really making a lot of people very angry and very really activating them, saying, you know, look, we've got all these nationally determined contributions, but we're not getting the 100 billion that was already promised in adaptation finance, let alone loss and damage. So it's going to be very big. The problem, okay, so I think the really tricky thing politically about the whole loss and damage debate is that a lot of it is a reparations debate. It's about paying for past historical damage and mistakes. And as we've seen with other reparations debates, for example, in the US and so on, it's politically incredibly toxic because it's very hard to sell to the public, many of whom go, hey, it wasn't me personally, you know, yeah, it might have been my grandparents, but like, you can't visit their sins upon me. And it, as you pointed out, Juliet, how to determine the criteria. How on earth do you say, you know, how much should Pakistan get for current floods versus the Maldives for the fact that they'll lose all their territory? What kind of reparations should the Maldives get? Should it be money or should they get land? You know, should they be allowed to settle in on somebody else's territory that now becomes the sovereign territory of the Maldives because their territory has been taken away from them by erosion and then sea level rise and death of coral and all the rest of it. So it's incredibly difficult to determine criteria. Now, I think there will be a lot of very interesting proposals for how to do this. There's a lot of creativity going on around it at COP27. So I think it's really worth looking at what different climate justice groups come up with. So both the governments, but also there are loads of NGOs working on this, especially in the global South. And there are a lot of kind of ethical issues and there are practical issues. So I think that there's going to be a lot lot of debate about this issue. It's not clear to me that there's an outcome right now, but over the next few years, it'll be big. It's a little bit like, sad to say, the Middle East peace process. It generates thousands of PhDs almost every year, which doesn't mean that in the real world things get better, but it's a really fundamental set of issues in international relations, and so I think it's going to be a feature on the climate agenda for the years to come. Then on nuclear, okay, so I'm not a physicist, but I'll just give you a couple of kind of historical facts that are worth taking into account when it comes to the whole question of nuclear. So nuclear is very cheap energy while the nuclear reactor is working. Okay, so on the day it starts generating electricity to the day it stops generating electricity, incredibly cheap, looks great. The problem is when you look at the costs before that period and the costs after that period, you get a completely different set of figures. So the costs before are usually government guarantees to de-risk the investment in nuclear. There is no country in the world in which nuclear reactors have been built 100% with private investment. Always the state has had to put in something, either in terms of public money or guarantees, risk guarantees, and the like, and so on. And usually the state has also, at the other end of the process, taken the responsibility for the costs, not just of decommissioning the reactor, but of maintaining safety at the reactor for 100, 200 years after it ceased operation. So there's a burden on the taxpayer, on the state, before and after, that is not taken into account in the pricing of electricity from nuclear while it's being generated. Okay, so I mean, we could almost have called everything I've said tonight the failure of pricing, the failure of price signals. That's why we're in this mess, that we have not priced appropriately the real environmental impact. And nuclear is, I think, a classic example of that. So to quote, I have a colleague who is an expert on nuclear and other forms of generation. And what she says is, nuclear power is the most expensive way to boil water ever invented. Because if you think about it, what nuclear is boiling water. Okay, so you do a nuclear reaction to create steam, which drives turbines that produce electricity. Now, you could actually drive turbines with solar or wind or wave power. Okay, there are a lot of ways of driving turbines. It's not like nuclear, say, unlike, for example, hydrogen, which also has to be made with electricity. So green hydrogen is another very controversial topic. But hydrogen has specific function of burning at a very high temperature. So if you need a very high temperature in an industrial process, for example, then you can, or indeed just for cooking, actually, it's quite hard to generate enough electricity through solar panels. You probably need hydrogen. You don't need nuclear. All it does is to produce electricity. And if you can produce electricity without these massive costs, and the second factor is the waste. We still don't know how to store the waste. Okay. And then just a bonus, I'll give you a third factor. Russia has just proved that any nuclear power plant is a sitting, toxic, dirty bomb waiting to be exploited by some hostile power. So what Russia is doing at Zaporizhia and the other nuclear power plants in Ukraine, I think, is fundamentally going to change public attitudes towards nuclear safety. We've always assumed that nuclear reactors are too valuable for anybody, state or non-state actor, to try to disrupt them. There has been some talk about terrorism and then, oh no, you can't possibly hack their computers and so on. Okay, the Russians are now proving that that's not the case. So I think nuclear you need to look quite carefully at the economics of it.
Thanks. I think we'll finish up there, although I feel like there's so much more we could take and learn from you, be it on nuclear or an EU Green Deal, right through to trade policy, geopolitics, economics, price failure. I mean, it's fantastic. I feel like we've done a tour de force through a bunch of size subjects, which many of you are probably can take away and think and reflect on. So I will say a huge thank you, Heather, for coming, for sharing your knowledge, for sharing all that you've have done tonight. And please, everyone else, share with me a great thanks. Hopefully we can have you back sometime.
With pleasure.
In a bit of
I
circumstance.
had buon appetito.
Thanks, Michael.
Very nice to
Ciao.
see you, Michael. Looking
Great
forward
to
to the
see
next
you
time.
too. Me too. Ciao.